It's my pleasure this morning to introduce Elise Harris. Elise is the senior correspondent covering the Vatican for the Catholic News Agency and EWTN in Rome. Before joining the Rome team for CNA in 2013, she worked as a part-time employee in CNA's Denver office, assisting with multimedia and content management. She graduated from the University of Northern Colorado in 2010 and holds a degree in philosophy and communications. On a personal note, I first met Elise in St. Peter's Square in 2014 while we were awaiting the filming of the chase scene in the next James Bond Spectre movie. So, the next time you watch the movie, look closely and you might just see us as the car swerves in front of St. Peter's. More germane to today's proceedings, in May of 2017, she traveled aboard the papal plane with Pope Francis on his trip to Fatima, where she witnessed and reported on his Marian devotion firsthand and offered many of the insights she'll now share with us in her talk, Francis at Fatima, Church Governance is Rooted in Pastoral Concern. Elise, we're delighted to welcome you to Holy Cross. After the talk, Father William Clark will offer a response.
Thanks, Mike. I appreciate it. And as Mike said, we met at James Bond, which I think there's no more appropriate we need to define our dynamic than James Bond bringing us together. So I want to thank you guys for coming. I want to thank Holy Cross for hosting us. It's really been a pleasure to be here. We've had great hospitality this week. And I just want to say that I'm very excited to be speaking about Fatima, not only because I had the opportunity to be there and to be with the Pope on the plane for this trip, but because I think that it's really, the apparitions are something that's been very monumental in the church, and I would really argue that there's something, that nothing has really impacted the church or the world, in a sense, more than the Fatima apparitions from 100 years ago. Nothing has been spoken about more, nothing has been talked about more, nothing has been studied about more, I think, than these apparitions, and trying to understand what exactly Our Lady wanted and what she's about. And I think part of that is a lot of the other Marian apparitions that are out there, they all talk about conversion to some extent. They all talk about the need to do penance and to repent and to convert. But I think the thing that really draws people to Fatima and kind of freaks them out a little bit is she talks about hell. And that's something that makes everybody a little bit uncomfortable, and it makes us a little more motivated, I guess, in our search for conversion. And, every pope since Paul VI, since his visit in 1967 to Fatima, the shrine there, I think every pope since him has visited the shrine. It's something that popes do just because of the nature of the apparitions and the contents of them, which I'll get into in a minute. But and in John Paul II, because of his relation to Fatima and being kind of the subject, it was revealed later that he was the subject of like the third secret of Fatima, which was the prediction of a papal assassination, and that was later confirmed by the visionary Lucia to be the attempt on John Paul II's life in 1980. And John Paul II credited Our Lady of Fatima for the saving of his life. And so while there's been like an incredible devotion among all popes to Fatima, I think in a sense it's prophetic that Pope Francis was the one who was there to celebrate the Marian apparitions, the 100th anniversary last year. Not just because of his own personal devotion. It's a cultural thing. There's a lot of devotion to Marian. There's a huge devotion to Mary in the Latin American culture, and he has a lot of, he has its strong roots in terms of popular devotion, but he's also all about conversion and kind of closeness to people. And I think that's something that's really unique for him, that links him to Fatima in a really unique way. And so in the talk, what I'm going to try to do here in the next few minutes is kind of outline the context of what was going on culturally at the time of the Fatima apparitions, what was Our Lady talking about, and how I think that reflects in some things Pope Francis's vision, how Fatima can be an example of what Francis aims to do or what his motivations are when we're talking about going forward in his papacy, the governance, and the reform of the church. But to start out, I wanted to actually quote something by Cardinal Wojtyła when he was still, the future John Paul II, when he was still cardinal. He gave some Lenten spiritual exercises to the Roman Curia, the church's governing body. And in the very last one, he wrote about Mary, and he said, "Mary is the one who in a very special way is united with the church at the most difficult moments in her history, when the attacks on her become most threatening." And he said that it's precisely in these periods when Christ, and therefore his church, the Pope, bishops, religious and lay people, become a sign of contradiction in society that Mary appears particularly close to the church, because the church is always, in a way, her Christ. And so when we look at this Mary being close to her people and close to the church, and therefore her son, in moments of difficulty, I think this is especially relevant when we look at the context of what was happening when the Fatima apparitions took place. And so what was happening in 1917? You had the First World War that was going on. You had Portugal itself was pulled into that. You had Portugal also was kind of just coming out of the aftermath of their own revolution and coup d'etat that overthrew the monarchy, and they established the first Portuguese Republic. And then you have the new constitution that they established after that was based on Freemasonry, and it's thought to omit religion from the public life. And under the new governance around this same time period, you had Catholic churches and schools were closed. It was forbidden to wear clerics in public for the priests. It was forbidden to ring church bells and to kind of sing and have major faith events. And so between the years of 1911 to 1916, there were nearly 2,000 priests, monks, and nuns were killed by anti-Christian groups in Portugal. And at the same time, so you have World War I, you have kind of these events happening, the revolution, the results of the revolution happening in Portugal, but you also have, when you look to Russia, what was happening in Russia. Mary speaks very concretely about Russia in her apparitions, very clearly and very specifically about Russia. And at the same time, Mary appeared in 1917, and 1917 was the year that the Russian Revolution started. And so you have kind of the Bolsheviks coming in, overthrowing the Tsarist Empire, and in the wake of that, Vladimir Lenin comes in and establishes the USSR, the Soviet Union. And it's no secret that immediately after that, they launched a campaign that was called the Anti-Religious Campaign. And this has been called one of the most explosive moments in the 20th century in terms of the effect that it had. And the Anti-Religious Campaign, they are confiscating property from the churches, Catholic, Christian, Orthodox. They're kind of gutting these, a lot of things. A lot of people were arrested, a lot of people were killed. And, in the time of communism, the numbers are out there, but it's estimated maybe some 70 to 100 million people were killed, most of them in China and Russia. And so you have all of this happening, and this is the backdrop against, which Mary appears in Fatima, a tiny little village to 3 shepherd children who are 7, 9, and 11 at the time. And so this is what's going on culturally. And in her message, Mary, I'm not going to go into all of the apparitions and the contents of exactly what she said. That's known fairly, but her call was really a call to repentance. It was a call to conversion, and it was a call to prayer. She said we have to repent, we have to pray, we have to convert ourselves, but we also have to pray and offer sacrifices for the conversion of sinners. And she said that this was necessary not only to avoid personal damnation, but also so that further global tragedies wouldn't happen. And she asked the children to pray for this. She specifically asked them for many sacrifices, specifically praying the rosary. And she asked for not just conversion, but kind of a whole transformation, in a sense, of how we offer ourselves and our sacrifices for sinners. And she also offered the children 3, I think we all know about the secrets of Fatima, the 3 big secrets, and the first one, I think that she showed them what was a vision of hell, in one of her apparitions. She showed the children a vision of hell, which is startling if you're 3 little kids. And I think they were so shocked about it that immediately afterwards they started to pray. But she said, this is really the result. This is what is going to happen if we don't pray, if we don't convert. This is what's going to happen. This is what we risk falling into. So there was that. There was the prediction. There was a prediction of the papal assassination, which is actually the 3rd one. And that was, later explained to be that was confirmed as the assassination attempt on John Paul II. But then we have her prediction about Russia, right? And that was the 2nd secret. And she said, in this secret she gave to the children, she said the war was going to end, but if people don't stop offending God with their sins, then another even worse one will begin. And this is, of course, World War II. And she said another one was going to begin, and God is going to punish the world for its many crimes by means of war, hunger, and persecution of the Church and the Holy Father. And to prevent all of this, she asked for the consecration of Russia to her Immaculate Heart. And it took a long time to get this done, but eventually it happened when we consecrated the world to Fatima. And Sister Lucia, the last visionary who made it into adulthood, confirmed that she said this was acceptable, that kind of did the job. But it took a while to get done. And so if we fast forward then, so this is what Our Lady said in the apparitions in 1917. If we fast forward to 2017, at the 100th anniversary of the Fatima apparitions, looking at the situation culturally, I think we can say that not much has changed in a sense that we still have attacks on Christ and His church. We have an increase in anti-Christian persecution. I would say more people are dying now from anti-Christian persecution than they did 100 years ago. We have an increase in wars. You look at, Pope Francis, we don't have like a world war per se that's, clearly defined that way, but Pope Francis has said how many times that we're living in a third world war being fought piecemeal. And this is true if you look to the Middle East, Syria, Iraq, a lot of the countries down there, Yemen, and if you look to the Ukraine and Africa, the Sudan, Central African Republic, we have kind of little fractured conflicts all over the place. And that really hasn't stopped. Wars have almost increased, and they're just spread out. But you also have an increase in secularism and individualism. And Benedict XVI spoke against this a lot. And you have Francis coming in and saying, against the cultural trends, it's not so much atheist regimes anymore coming in and trying to eradicate Christ. It's just indifference to Him and to other people. And so it's almost, in that sense, you could say, what is it worse? Which is worse, trying to eradicate God and tell people that He's irrelevant, or just being indifferent to Him, saying that He doesn't matter. And so that's what Pope Francis speaks about. And he says this has almost taken on a new dynamic. The attitude towards God is just people don't care. And if you look at the church itself, this is culturally, but if you look at the church itself, in many ways the church today is also in difficulty and in crisis in many ways. And you see that in many ways the church, you have the abuse scandals that have rocked the world in every part of the world, and that have sadly kind of tarnished the church in many places. But you also have the church kind of coming out of their own cultural shift. And in many ways, it's only been 50 years since the Second Vatican Council, and in many ways she's still trying to grapple with a lot of the changes that came out of that and understand how to implement them and put into place the renewal that the Council asked for. And you still have the resignation of a pope. That hasn't happened in 500 years. When Benedict XVI resigned, that's something I think that shocked the whole world. And we're trying to deal with all this other stuff. We have him resign, and then after that, we have the first Jesuit pope and the first pope from Latin America. So there's a whole lot of changes going on all at once. And I think the church, in a sense, is like, wait a minute, what's happening? And it's not that this difficulty is a bad thing per se. It's just a lot all at once, and it's a change. And I think it's interesting to see, like the presence of Mary and the anniversary of the apparitions happening kind of in this context. And, when Francis was elected in 2013, he was elected with a very clear mandate for reform. That was what he was asked to do, is kind of carry out a reform, a renewal of the church and her structures, the Roman Curia, the governance of the church, the people who run it in Rome, to renew this, but also to kind of carry it forward and to take it to the next step. Like, where are we going and how can we get there? Francis was elected to do that and to take us there. And if we look at the very beginning, I think from the very beginning of his pontificate, it's been attached to Fatima. And I think Fatima, because he consecrated his papacy to Fatima just 2 months after being elected, on May 14th, 2013, Pope entrusted his whole process of reform to Our Lady. And he asked kind of the Patriarch of Lisbon, the Archbishop of Lisbon at the time, to do the consecration. And in the prayer, when this is happening on May 14th, the Cardinal is praying, and he's praying, he's talking to the Pope, he's talking to the people, and he talks to Our Lady very directly at one point. And in the prayer, he says to her, like Our Lady, grant Pope Francis the gift of discernment to know how to identify the paths of renewal for the Church. Grant him the courage not to falter in following the paths suggested by the Holy Spirit. Protect him in the difficult hours of suffering so that he may overcome in charity the trials that the renewal of the Church will bring him. And so from the very beginning, I think Pope Francis and his reform have been attached to Our Lady and I think he very much had in his mind to visit the shrine for the 100th anniversary of the election. I think that was very present almost from the beginning. And I think if we look at what Pope Francis is doing, we can see a lot of, I think, parallels in a sense, between what Our Lady is doing and where Pope Francis is coming from, in the sense that he's, not only is it his cultural roots and popular piety and devotion and kind of the closeness and being close to the people and their lived experience of the faith, but also his own personal emphasis on the importance of conversion, and personal and pastoral. And he talks about it all the time. When you can see this, in all of his speeches and homilies and the various things that the activities that he does, he usually always talks about the need to change mentality. He calls out attitudes that he thinks, are problematic. Don't be hypocrites, don't be corrupt. But he also talks a lot about the need to pray and to kind of transform and have a transformation of mind and heart. And every year he meets with the Curia, the members of the Roman Curia, the people who govern the church, the governing body, I should say, in Rome. He meets with them every year in December before Christmas. And these speeches have kind of become famous, in a sense, for what is the Pope going to say this time? He usually says something very strong, very strong images, very strong critiques at times. But then in 2016, he offered a speech in the speech he offered 12 guiding principles for his reform. He said, my reform can be boiled down to these 12 principles. And a lot of them had to do with conversion. I don't know how many times conversion was said in the document. I didn't count it, but it was a lot. And I wrote an analysis on the speech at the time that said his reform could pretty much be summed up in that one word, conversion, and a desire for conversion. And I said in that piece, and I'll continue to insist today, that it's probably impossible to understand Pope Francis's papacy without understanding how much he sees personal conversion as a prerequisite to any kind of structural reform. And in the speech in 2016, he told the Curia specifically that efforts for reform and renewal in the church are not an end in itself, but rather it's a process of growth and above all conversion. He said the reform will be effective only if it is carried out with men and women who are renewed and not simply new. And he said that changing up the staff and shifting offices, and he's done that several times. He's kind of merged a few. He's changed up personnel. He said this is necessary and it's bound to happen as part of this process, but it's not enough on its own. Just making these shifts is not enough. He said the reform will be successful. They said only the conversion of people will make the reform bear fruit and be successful. And so when he listed out, I'm not going to list his 12 points right now, but in the very first two that he listed were dedicated to personal conversion and pastoral conversion. And those from the very front, he's saying, this is what I'm asking for. I need people who are ready to change. I need people who are ready to be renewed. And he always talks about letting ourselves be renewed by Christ. Let us allow ourselves to be touched by him, by his mercy. And he always uses that language. And so from the very beginning, this is how we see his goals. This is what we see he really wants. But in order to obtain that, we have to see what we're doing wrong. And this is where I think a lot of the Pope's strong critiques come in. 2 years prior to this speech, he had given another list to the Curia that was 15 illnesses that he saw that they had. And he said, you have existential schizophrenia and a spiritual Alzheimer's, in a sense of living a double life. You're forgetting what you came here to do. You're getting wrapped up in work, and you're forgetting the actual point of why we're here. And so he uses very strong language and very very vivid descriptions, to point out these illnesses. But in his mind, it's really like encouraging everyone in the church to do a big examination of conscience and to say, okay, he's giving us what we need to identify. So do I have these things? And from there, do I fall into any of these attitudes? And how can I change and move forward so that I can be in relation with Christ, but also carry forward the mission of the church? So I think that's something that he's really looking for, and he's telling people, don't be hypocrites, don't be corrupt. He wants to kind of prod us in that way, and it's not comfortable all the time. But I think that's what his ultimate goal is, and I think that's obvious from what he's said and done. And there's so many times when he said that the church is, in the Latin phrase, semper reformanda. It's in a constant state of reform. It's in a constant process of transformation. Like, we're never going to stop, but we're always going to be in this. And we always have to be questioning ourselves in that way. And I think that's obvious from what he said and done, that's his goal, and that's what he wants from the church as a whole. And some people said maybe his critiques at times could be overly harsh or overly negative. And, there's a joke that he says whenever he meets with priests, God's mercy, when he meets with priests and religious, he's especially harsh. And there's a kind of a joke saying, like, okay, he always says God's mercy is for everyone except for priests and religious, because he's usually so hard with them. But I think he has a very clear idea of what needs to be changed and how he wants to do that. And part of this is conversion, but also conversion in the sense that the church is no longer, he always says, it's no longer looking inward, but moving out and going outward towards the people. So I convert so that I can then reach the people. And he's all about closeness. And he always talks about, proximity and closeness to people. And part of this, I think I'm going to get into a little bit of his, some of his formation in Latin America, in the sense that part of this is culturally for him, part of it's part of his formation. It's part of who he is, this idea and this attachment to the people, the ordinary people of everyday life. And you can't understand Pope Francis without understanding his formation in what can be called his Latin American theology, right? And this is become known more recently, as, Teología del Pueblo, the theology of the people, because of its emphasis on closeness to the ordinary person. And it emphasizes not only closeness to them, but it places a strong emphasis on their expressions of popular devotion and piety, such as you have large prayer events, you have processions with all the colors and, the singing, and you have pilgrimages, and you have visits to shrines, devotions of saints, and if any of you have ever been in South America or Latin America, you'll see, at least my experience is that you see people constantly going to saints and putting these necklaces, around them with a big silver heart, as an act of thanksgiving for a prayer that was answered or an intention that they received. And so that's all part of this experience. And Pope Francis was very well formed in this. And there were a lot of major thinkers during the day, a lot of the major theologians and very relevant theologians, Latin America in the 20th century, they were pushing this Teología del Pueblo forward, and in just a couple of the names that some of you might know from the day, Father Juan Carlos Canone, I think he was a Jesuit, and he was a professor of Bergoglio, but he's actually still alive, and he's in his 90s. But Francis was very influenced by this guy. He was influenced by Argentinian Father Lucio Gera, which I think you guys study, and then there's an Uruguayan man, a layman, Alberto Methol Ferré. And so these are these are just a couple of names. There's more that, and he's influenced very much by Romano Guardini, and Austin talked about him a little bit last night. But these are just a couple of the names to throw out there. And in a sense that these guys really were essential to the Pope's formation, and they're essential to how he thinks and moves and works. And this whole spirituality, this whole movement of, the theology of the people, it really emphasized a preferential option for the poor of all. And it was not, differently than Marxism. Marxism didn't really not Marxism, but like liberation theology and Marxist strains of that. I think theology of the people was more emphasis on popular devotion. Like, liberation theology didn't necessarily view popular devotion as something that was valid. They thought it was going to be a distraction to obtaining their goals. Whereas, the theology of the people really saw this expression of the faith lived in the people as something that at that time was going to unite Latin America, because it brought people together. It was going to unite Latin America as a continent with one faith and one language, And so when we're looking at this, the belief was that really it was going to help preserve faith in the continent. And we see that Francis, his emphasis, we see this in a lot of the things that he does and says as well. We see this closeness to the people, the desire to be close to the people and their lived experience of the faith in terms of going to where the people are, and not necessarily, a lot of times people might not go to church, but they go to these events. They go to these processions, they go to, major faith events at these shrines. And so if the people aren't coming into the church, let's go meet them and let's see what's happening there and what we can learn from them and their faith experience, and see if we can maybe bring them back a little bit. And so, so this is something I think the Pope has this closeness. This is where I think a lot of his emphasis on closeness to people, wanting to draw near to them, wanting the church to not necessarily be tied up in herself, but to be more open and to go and arrive to people and where they're at. That's where we see, I think, a lot of that coming from. I think it has its roots very much in this formation of him. And people say that maybe the Pope is overly pastoral, and that he doesn't have a big intellectual formation because he's so simple and he's so pastoral, but that's not the case. He's very well read in kind of the leading thinkers of the day, and he just applies it in a very, very he applies it in a very pastoral way. Instead, if he's not speaking to the intellectuals, he's speaking to the person in the pew, and that's his expression of it. And we can see this, even when he travels, we see this desire of him to be close to the people in terms of participating in, like, he'll oftentimes go to whatever shrine is, when he travels, he'll go to whatever shrine is most relevant for that place, for that country. And as we see, when he went to Brazil, he went to the shrine of Our Lady of Aparecida, which is in the main Marian devotion there. He went to the big shrine of Divine Mercy in Ecuador. In Poland, he went to the shrine of Our Lady of Czestochowa. In Mexico, Our Lady of Guadalupe. In Fatima, Our Lady of Fatima. He's constantly participating in the devotions of the people where he goes. And even in Rome, there's an icon called the Salus Populi Romani that he always visits. Before and after every international trip, he visits this. And it's not just a historic and important icon for the city of Rome, but it's important to him also as a Jesuit. It has roots in Jesuit devotion. And so it's a way for him he takes being the Bishop of Rome very seriously, and it's something very special to the Roman people, and the icon is the Holy Roman people. And so we see this desire for him to go close to people, to participate in their devotions. And he's always seeking to do that. He's always seeking, how can I reach out to people? How can I be close? And, he often says, how can we bend down, in a sense? How can we see the person, bend down, and pour out the balm of God's mercy and love on them? And he uses this language. It's just very rich language. And, when in terms of pastoral approach, I think some people say maybe this isn't the right approach. Maybe, we need to be more intellectual. But if we look at even St. John the 23rd, in his opening speech for the Second Vatican Council, he said that the church, in these meetings, the church must work out ways and means of expanding the truths of the faith in a manner that are more consistent with the predominantly pastoral view of the church's teaching office. And so he said, it's basically what he is saying here is, we need to think of how to take our teachings and be a little more pastoral with them and be a little closer to them. And that was something, we see that from the council to Francis, is something that has happened. I don't have time to go into all of, the consistency of each papacy and how we see that, but it's something that if you have there's a little thread that can be drawn there. And in terms of when we see this in Pope Francis and his leading of the church, how do we see this in his governance of the church? We see it expressed in a lot of ways, this desire to be close. And I'm just going to go over a few. I don't have time to go into a ton of them, but since the beginning, he always placed a very strong role in decentralization. From the very beginning, decentralization has been something that's been a key word in his pontificate. And saying that not everything needs to be tied up in Rome. Like, his idea is go out, put more emphasis, put more power, more decision-making into the local bishops' conferences, because we see that they're the ones who are closer to the people. They're the ones who know the reality on the ground. They're the ones who are going to be able to know how to discern situations a little better and make perhaps better decisions because of the knowledge that they have. And so not everything is as centralized. And we see, this in just a couple examples. We see in he had recently released a motu proprio, allowing bishops' conferences to take care of translations of liturgical texts. Before, everything had to be done in Rome. The whole process of, drafting and approving the translations. And he said, now I'm going to let the local bishops deal with this. You can draft your own translations, you can approve it, and then Rome will go over it just to make sure it's faithful to the original Latin. We're not going too crazy with the things we're saying, and this, I think, has come from experiences. Like, for one example, when this came out, I was talking to a member of the Vatican department in charge of these kind of texts. We were saying, okay, well, how is this going to help? How is this going to help people? Is it really going to make that big of a difference? And he told me, he's like, well, when we made the translation, the English translation, as you guys know, was just redone a couple of years ago. And he said, when we renewed that translation, we met with some of the bishops from Africa, and, where there are more tribal spiritualities. And he said, okay, well, when you say, before the response, you say, okay, the Lord be with you. And, and also with you is the previous response. And now it's, and with your spirit. He said, they told us that in that context, like in the context of their culture, that word "and with your spirit" can have other connotations, cultural connotations that could be problematic. And so this is a way of trying to address those things, because those people know better how the words and the language are going to be received in their culture. And so it's better to just let them do it, and we can have the final say. And so we see it in that. We see it in the Pope's decision to kind of streamline the marriage annulment process. Before, if you're going through an annulment process, everything had to be done out of Rome. And there was an automatic, whatever ruling, there was an automatic appeal, and that was all done out of Rome. And it, a lot of times, the courts were hard for people to access, in the sense everything was done at the Vatican court, and that the courts they would go to locally to initiate the process were oftentimes far and hard to reach. So what the Pope said is, okay, let's make this a little easier. We don't have to judge it in Rome. We can judge it on the ground. The local bishop, the diocese will have a tribunal. The local bishop can be a judge, and it, only if we don't have to have an automatic appeal if it's a clear case of annulment. And if there is an appeal, that can be done in Rome, but everything else is on the ground. And he's basically saying, let's make it a little bit easier to access, and let's make it quicker. And he made it free, so it's easier. Everything is helping the people get to, how can we make this faster for the people so they can be in a more regularized state, and so it's about, in that sense, it's about kind of, I think, being close to people in that sense. How do we bring them closer to the church and back into a more normal situation? And so that's just one example. Also in the Jubilee of Mercy, we see kind of this, and there was a lot of things previously that you would only do in Rome, the Holy Door where you get an indulgence, you could only be in Rome for that. And the Pope said, no, for this one, I'm going to say Holy Doors in every diocese. And I'm going to allow every priest to forgive the sin of abortion, which wasn't possible before, but he allowed that for the Jubilee. And so things like this, that he's constantly trying to make it easier for the faithful to access the sacraments, to access the grace of God and the mercy of God. But we also see, in his ad limina visits with bishops, the whole process has changed. Before you go in, you get a speech, you'd meet with, ad limina visits are, every 5 years the bishops of a country visit Rome. And they meet with the Pope, and they meet with, various Vatican departments. And so Francis really changed up the style in a sense. He's saying, okay, I'm not going to give you the formal speech. We all know he's famous now for tossing the speech and just talking directly with people. But he does that with the bishops too now. In a sense, he's saying, okay, I just want to talk to you, and I want to hear from you guys what you have to say. I'm going to give you a couple thoughts, but I want to hear your thoughts, and I want you to ask me questions. And that's been, all the bishops that I've talked to have said that that's been a lot more helpful. And they said that also when they meet with Vatican dicasteries, it's following more of that style as well, more interactive, more Q&A, less like, here's a tour and this is what we do, but it's more interactive. It's bringing them closer and helping them to understand how things function on either side better, better, so that we can better respond to the needs of the people on the ground. And we see this too in like his decision to have his first two synods ever were not dedicated to anything specifically intellectual or theological or doctrinal, but they're pastoral on the family, and we have the synod on youth coming up. And so everything he's doing is really with this desire for a pastoral approach. How do we reach out to the people? How do we be close to them? How do we bring them back? And so I think this is something that, Pope Francis, this is what he's about. When we look at him, this is what, and kind of the goals of his papacy, or, the mindset behind the reform is something this is what it's about. It's about conversion, and it's about being close to people and converting so I can be close to them. And I think that, Fatima was a really, really clear expression of this. I thought it was just a perfect, expression of in terms of what Our Lady said, and how, the whole phenomenon of the apparitions helps us to kind of see what Francis is doing and what I think his goals are in this sense. And I wanted to close with just one quote that I thought was very beautiful and expressed this really pastoral heart of the Pope. It was in a video message that he sent to the people of Portugal before his visit to Fatima. So he didn't actually go, but he sent a video message in anticipation to just say, hey, I'm coming. Get excited. It was pretty much the thing, but in the message, that was pretty much his message. And so, but he said something I thought was really beautiful that I just want to read it to you guys to close with. He said in the message that it is as the universal pastor of the church that I would like to come before the Madonna and to offer her a bouquet of the most beautiful blossoms that Jesus entrusted to my care. By this, I mean all of our brothers and sisters throughout the world who have been redeemed by Christ's blood, none excluded. That is why I need to have all of you join me there. I need to feel your closeness, whether physical or spiritual. The important thing is that it comes from the heart. And with all of us forming one heart and soul, I will then entrust you to Our Lady, asking her to whisper to each one of you, my immaculate heart will be your refuge and the path that leads you to God. So that was a beautiful closing statement. So thank you very much.
This is a long-standing feature of traditional devotion in Catholicism. In my experience, it can form a part of a simple and strong faith that can be well integrated into family and parish life. So, growing up, I remember, one of my first memories connected with this is sitting in a rather odd arrangement that we had in our house for watching TV, because the TV had to be squirreled away in a closet. So, but I remember sitting with the family in these kind of confined quarters, watching the Song of Bernadette, right? And being fascinated by that whole experience of the apparition at Lourdes, and sort of growing up with the notion that there was this place where people would go and seek healing and so forth, so that the notion of a God who was available to us for healing in this very concrete way was conveyed in that whole devotion to Lourdes. And then, of course, growing up, we didn't have one of these explicitly in the church that I attended growing up, but there were in churches around places where they had built grottos for devotion, and again a specific reference to the apparition at Lourdes. And I think to this day I have a bottle of Lourdes water that someone brought to me, maybe not quite as long ago as that, but a long time ago anyway. The other thing I think that I've experienced with the whole devotion to Marian apparitions is the possibility for deep conversion that they hold. And this experience I particularly had in a devotion that Pope Francis has been quite, to say the least, standoffish about, is the devotion to Our Lady of Medjugorje. But I visited Medjugorje in 2001, and I was expecting to be spending time with a lot of very traditionally pious people. That was my expectation. And I certainly met a lot of traditionally pious people. But I also took my turn in the confessionals at Medjugorje, which are a phenomenon in themselves. Somebody, a very generous donor, paid for a whole series of confessional booths that are outside and independently climate controlled, and have a whole list of the languages spoken by the priest who's inside, so that people line up according to language. Mine had the one sign, English. But what surprised me most was the number of people in the relatively short time that I was there who came and told me that this was their first confession in 30 years, or it was their first confession maybe ever. And there were a surprising number of people who had come to this place without expecting very much. They had been brought there by someone, or they had come out of curiosity, and had found their lives really changed by this experience, that they had been really profoundly moved by this experience. And I could, with some confidence, get the sense that this confession that they were making was coming from the heart in such a way that you could expect that this was going to have long-term results. It wasn't just, a passing fancy on their part to go to confession. I also have seen quite recently a film made about pilgrims to Medjugorje that I found very moving, largely because it did not focus on... At the beginning of this film, you expect that it's all these people who are going to go and get healed of their various infirmities. What happened was that the producer of the film essentially set up a lottery. He chose people according to the way that they described why they wanted to go to Medjugorje, and he gave them a free trip. And then he followed them. And nobody had any really extraordinary physical experience. As a matter of fact, there was a woman there who was dying of cancer as she went, and the film at the end shows the scene at her death. He followed the people after they got back from the trip. And what I found particularly moving about that was just the way in which people's spiritual lives were galvanized by the experience that they had at Medjugorje. And so it isn't about necessarily a lot of mystical experiences and miracles and that sort of thing for ordinary people, even if that is the thing that attracts people's interest. If a miracle is precisely something that makes you look and see, then the apparitions and the miracles that have taken place in these locations have done their job to that extent. All right, so that's one side where I see Marian apparitions as something that really galvanizes. But then there's this other side, particularly, I have to say, with regard to Fatima, where I've had the experience of groups that claim devotion to Fatima almost as if that was their primary faith. So at least in this country, Fatima has very often been used as a platform for extreme culture wars divisiveness. And last semester I used some of the literature of one of these groups to show students in one of my classes how Pope Francis, who you would expect being Pope would be respected by the most traditionalist people in the Catholic Church, is being accused flat out of heresy by members of a particularly extreme Fatima group, simply because he attended the celebration of the Reformation at the Cathedral of Lund in Sweden. That was only one instance of them calling him a heretic, by the way. So I'm wondering how we can tap the energy that I was talking about in the first set of examples, and harness that evangelical fervor for the body of the church without feeding that kind of pure remnant mentality that is possible in some of these other groups who think of themselves as, we are the ones who have really gotten it, nobody else has, so basically we're the church. So when I think about how Francis is including this devotion in his papacy, I wonder what it is that he understands as still resonating about Fatima so deeply with many Catholics, including himself. And I wonder if it's that sense of cultural and political loss per se, which seems to drive some of these more sectarian mentalities, or even the conviction that Mary somehow stands between us and an otherwise distant and wrathful God. It was another Marian experience that I'll just toss in here. I was in Jamaica as a pastor for 3.5 years. Before that, I was there before I was ordained. It was actually in that period that I experienced a hurricane in Jamaica that came in September. In August, there had traditionally been a pilgrimage with the statue of Mary from Kingston to Morant Point, which is about 50 miles walk. That year, for one reason or another, it had not been held. And then we got the hurricane. So there were very sincere Catholics who were saying with no hesitation that what had happened was that Mary, who is usually the one who is shielding us from God's wrath, didn't get her devotion, so she stepped aside. And the island got completely ravaged by the hurricane. That's pretty obviously not Catholic teaching. But there are ways in which some of the uses of these devotions open up these sectarian possibilities. So what I'm thinking is that the Pope is understanding these devotions according to Teología del Pueblo as a way of breaking through the polarization, because what he's interested in is the pastoral needs of the people, and he's using their own devotions to get at those pastoral needs, because those devotions are his devotions as well. It's not just a device, a strategy on his part. But I think, and this is where I would differ from something that Elise said, that I don't think that this is about convert so that we can avoid evil consequences and draw people back to the church. I think that if we listen to the kind of thing that Austin Ivory was talking about yesterday with regard to the mercy of God, that the point is that we need to encounter that mercy, and that in the encounter we are converted to a deeper understanding of the presence of God in the world, and then more able, yes, to witness and enable those encounters for others. But it's not, again, a prerequisite, because God makes the first move when it comes to mercy. I also think that encounter with mercy is necessary before we're going to be doing any converting, because it's only from that perspective of mercy that we can witness to the presence of God in the world. And so that we're actually opening ourselves not to haul other people in from where they might be, but actually going to them to understand why they are where they are, and to learn from that, so that becomes part of our conversion as well. So I see this as, and this goes along with the decentralization as well, I see this as an opening to what God is doing among God's people, and not something that we do in order to then go out and bring more people into our way of being, our way of thinking. Rather, an opportunity to find God's mercy at work in places that we never expected to find it. When I was at Medjugorje, somebody commented that why is it that Mary always appears in such difficult places to walk to? Always have these rocky paths that you're trying to get to, up high hills and so forth. It seems to me that this is one more indication of Mary's bringing the presence of God to unexpected and difficult places. It's a good metaphor for that. Places where we will find God at work when we get there, not places where we will bring God so that he can work. That's a good place to stop.
Thank you, Bill. So we have time for a few questions.
Because I think some people, when they hear like Our Lady's prediction at Fatima, can come off as very negative, like a negative attitude towards Russia. Our Lady hates Russia, and that's not the case. And I think what you speak of is there's actually a very huge devotion to Mary in the Orthodox Church in Russia. And just as a little snippet, there's actually a very, very famous and very historic icon of Mary called Our Lady of Kazan. That's it's a healing icon. There's, miracles attributed to it, healings attributed to this icon. I think it dates back to like the 1500s. And this icon actually, okay, so two things. So related to I'll get back to the icon in a minute, but culturally speaking of the devotion, Russia's very known, the Orthodox Church is known for their icons in general, but particularly of Our Lady. I think they have like 7 different styles of icons of Our Lady. And before the revolution in Russia, Russia was actually known as the House of Mary because of the devotion that's there to her. And the specific icon that I was speaking of is called the Protection of Russia. And that was confiscated during, under the Soviet Union, that was confiscated, and it, sold and changed hands several times, and ironically ended up getting purchased by an organization called the Blue Army of Fatima, which is, one of these organizations dedicated to really putting the message Our Lady of Fatima out there. But it was purchased by them, and actually they set up a chapel to this icon in the Fatima shrine. And as soon as the Iron Curtain fell, John Paul II asked for the icon to be brought to Rome, and it was in his papal apartments. In 2004, he gave it back to Russia. And so I think there's also a very positive element of, the attention to Russia that Mary gives. I think she's very close to the people, and I think your observation is, very, very valid in a sense. I think there's obviously Mary's very attentive, I think. And I just think that, it is one of the only apparitions where Mary talks so very much about hell. And I'm just relating the cultural context so we can understand, I think she, mostly to understand Mary's desire to be close to people at that time, to give a sign of hope, and that's something Francis, when he was there, talked about a lot. Is, before even going, he said, in the same video message I quoted, that his trip was supposed to be one of hope and of conversion. And I think what Mary gave there, was her call to conversion, and, her warnings, were ultimately a sign of hope for humanity, because she's invested and she's giving, she's telling us what she wants, what the Lord wants, and giving us an opportunity to convert. But it's a hopeful connotation, I guess, if that makes sense. Hopeful in the sense that man is messing up the world, but God's grace is bigger. And this is how he's asking us to respond, I think, if that...
Or what's left?
What's left? Well, I think just to continue doing what we've been doing. Who knows what's going to happen in the next 100 years, but I think, in outlining the cultural situation, I think my point, in outlining that was to say this is what her message was at that time, and here 100 years later, it's still just as relevant now. She speaks to, the thing is, she's speaking to the person, she's speaking in a specific cultural context that I think is relevant, but also to individual people within that. And her instructions the whole time were very personal and very individual, like pray, just pray the rosary, and I think that's going to continue to be valid, in whatever time. So it's sort of, the things she specifically asked for have been done in that sense. We have the only 2 things that actually were specifically limited to the Fatima period were the consecration of Russia and the papal assassination. Those things have already happened, but the only thing that's still always going to be there is hell, and our desire to, and it's not that it's all about hell, but you have the things that's always going to be a concern is, eternal damnation is a very real reality, but also hope is a very real reality, and the need to continually conform myself to God and to be touched by his mercy is, and to recognize the hope that the Lord gives us, I think is something that's always going to be relevant. And in terms of what else that's going to take shape in the future, I don't know. But I think that's the part that's going to continue to be relevant.
Can I add something here? When you were talking about the decentralization, at first I was thinking, okay, where does that piece of the puzzle fit into the whole thing? And there are various ways in which you can talk about this, but I was thinking that the importance in this regard of the Pope's attempts to pay more attention to the local churches might connect to what's next. That if there is a distant and almost mythic authority, Rome, and that's what's important in Catholicism, you give strength to people who want to say, we're the real ones, right? Because they can appeal over there. It's one of the reasons why they foam at the mouth over Francis, because he's not allowing this kind of appeal. But in the past, it's been able to just say, we're Roman Catholics, so This focus on the local churches means that the mercy that God is showing concretely through something like the apparitions at Fatima, or any of these kinds of extraordinary things that draw people together, the mercy that he's showing there has got to be lived out in Christian communities all over the world. And if I'm a true believer in the message, I can't just sequester myself in this little group that claims to have the truth without doing the hard work and the messy work of encountering face-to-face the brothers and sisters that I see in the parish or on the street, for that matter. And so the Pope's emphasis on those things kind of moves us to a different level that really is a universal priority, but it's one that can only happen on a face-to-face basis. And so if the Lord is showing in these apparitions the face of his mercy in Mary, and he's showing it to simple children in a place that really needs that message, and that's happened over and over again. Right? Ultimately, our living out of that message has got to be done in that same kind of context. And when it becomes this sort of political thing that separates people, that's when I really get nervous about it, but it seems to me that Francis is precisely trying to pull it out of that kind of context. Am I just kind of building castles in the air here, or does that sound like...
No, I think that's exactly, I think that is an accurate description. I think of what he's doing and what the direction he's taking is going to do. And I think his new exhortation is also, indicative of that. It's, it's showing, going out in the local context that you were saying, the everyday person, the everyday Catholic, but also the local situation. And I think that's an accurate description, in terms of how he's trying to make the mercy of God experienced and present for people.
Join me in thanking Elise and Father Clark.